an hour ago, and I said to her, you know what, Mona, you've got the most interesting perspective in this courtroom in the sense that she's sitting facing the defendant. She's in the jury box area, so she gets to see his face, his expressions, and she's been sketching this for all of us who are using her art to cover this case. So she told me, Jesse, it looks to her like David is, quote, on another plane. He seems completely disengaged. I'm reading his facial expressions kind of from off to the side. I'm watching him from an angle. He's not reacting much. You know, it's a lot the same as yesterday, where he's kind of just staring straight ahead at the witness who's testifying and then that overhead monitor that's projecting the exhibits. But no, he's really not reacting, and that includes when we see the victim's clothing, you know, her soiled, blood-stained, insect-infested, wet clothing that was found in the cadaver bags along with her remains. He's just staring straight ahead. He's got his arms folded. He's got this yellow legal notepad in front of him. It doesn't look to me like he's taking any notes. He's got a white styrofoam cup of water. I've counted maybe 2 or 3 interactions today where he's turned a little bit and kind of had, you know, a brief exchange of words with one of his attorneys. But other than that, he's not even moving, Jesse. It's really incredible.
But I'm not here to speculate, but I just have to ask, do you know if he's on any kind of medication or anything like that?
I don't know, Jesse, and we're not going to speculate on this show, but that is a question that's come up in sidebar conversations. We don't know, and that hasn't come up in court.
Okay.
I imagine if he is, it will.
Okay, got it. All right, let's talk about the substance. So the first witness back on the stand was this criminalist, right? And being questioned by the defense. What happened there?
So we ended yesterday with the cross-examination of an LAPD criminalist. She was the one who was called to process evidence found in David's garage. And that evidence included everything from trash bags to rubber floor mats to bloodstains. She was the one who tested chainsaws found in David's house. This was just about a week after the car was found in the Hollywood tow yard with the victim's remains in the front trunk, of course. So they continued with that cross-examination, and there was a lot of back and forth about the chainsaws. And here's why. Defense attorney Blair Burke noted there was no positive test indicating the possibility of blood on those chainsaws, so she kept on asking this LAPD witness for the prosecution why they didn't take those chainsaws into evidence. It sounded like she wanted to make the point that touch DNA, which they didn't test for, may have indicated something else, may have painted a more comprehensive picture of what exactly happened and who may have been involved, who else may have been involved, that is. But the criminalist was very sharp, very clear with her answers. At one point yesterday, she even brought her notes back out to make sure that she gave precisely the information that was documented during this investigation. So she said there did not appear to be any kind of forensic value to those chainsaws that were found in the garage, and that's why they were not taken into evidence. So my big takeaway from all of this is that perhaps those were not the weapons or tools used for dismemberment, even though they were found in David's garage during this search.
Let me just clarify this point, just so it's clear for our audience. I heard there was reporting, maybe even testimony, about a missing chainsaw. I don't know if that's accurate.
Yeah.
And what about any evidence of a cleanup, including of the chainsaws? Correct me if I'm wrong about either of those points.
Correct on the first point. There was another chainsaw, a Makita brand chainsaw that we talked about the other day that was ordered online and delivered to David's house. As far as I know, from the evidence presented so far, that chainsaw was not located during this search. The two other chainsaws, and here's why the criminalist said there really was no forensic value. She testified earlier that had they been used for dismemberment, there would have been no way for blood to be cleaned up to the point where their testing did not indicate something of forensic value. So when they did that initial test on scene and there was no presumptive positive, they elected not to take those two chainsaws into evidence. But yes, there is a missing one. There is another one, and I'm sure that's going to come up later in this testimony.
Look, as shocking as a case like this is, it is not a shock that there would be blood or presumed traces of blood at a crime scene. But what about fake blood? That is not something we were expecting, but it is one of the pieces of information we learned about today in David's preliminary hearing. Investigators say they found jugs of fake blood in the singer's garage. We'll talk a little bit about why the singer may have had that blood in his garage and how it could factor into this case as we move forward in just a moment with our reporter who is in the courtroom today. I want you to also take a look at some of the new sketches that we have in from artist Mona Edwards. David, today, once again, we're told looked emotionless. As prosecutors continue to lay out evidence they say proves that he killed Celeste as they try to move this case to the next step in the legal process. Joining us now, just stepping out of the courtroom, is Julia Dang, NBC LA reporter. Thanks for being here once again. I want to start with how things wrapped up at the end of today. And we heard from a deputy medical examiner. This is the person who did the autopsy on Celeste Rivas Hernandez. What stood out to you about what he had to say?
That's right, Chris. We just broke for the day. We actually didn't think we were going to get to this witness today, but Dr. Grintho took the stand just about 4 minutes before we wrapped for today, day 3 of this preliminary hearing in the murder case against 21-year-old David Anthony Burke. So he just started laying out his findings from this autopsy conducted September 10th. That was 2 days after this teenager's remains were found in the front trunk of David's Tesla. He's testifying about the state of decomposition. It was tough, incredibly tough to see the photos the other day in court. Hearing this testimony now from the deputy medical examiner who actually led the autopsy, this might be even tougher, Chris, in different ways. So I completely understood when the victim's parents actually got up and left the courtroom before he took the stand. They are not sitting in there for this testimony. But he's talking about the state of decomposition. He testified that when they weighed her remains, it only came out to 71 pounds. The last thing he said on the stand before we ended today was that she still had her braces on. And, of course, it was the dental records that helped them make that positive identification, because when they found her remains, there was so much decomposition, there was so much skin slippage, they couldn't identify her. There simply was not enough left.
And I saw in your notes, just kind of going through it, and just that line that she still had her braces on. And, we'll talk more about her family and everything they've been going through these last couple of days. But that just is a reminder that we're talking about not just a person who lost their life, but, such a young person at 14 years old at the center of this case. And this week trying to see what happens next. And as far as whether it continues down, the track to potentially going to trial one day, seemed like there was a lot of DNA evidence today and very much in the weeds about what was found, what tested positive. For you, what was the headline and kind of the moment when you think back through hours of testimony today, especially when it came to DNA, that really stood out to you?
My main takeaway, Chris, is that a good defense attorney, a strong defense team, can question anything and everything. And that is going to be key if this does indeed go to trial, which I think most people in that courtroom do expect. The threshold here in this preliminary hearing phase is much lower. The prosecution only needs to show probable cause. Think of that as kind of like a 51% threshold. But if this does go to trial, in order for a jury to convict, that's got to be beyond a reasonable doubt. Think of that as more like a 99.9% probability. So this is kind of like rehearsal for both sides. You know, they're testing out their witnesses. They're seeing how they perform on the stand as humans being questioned, you know, in front of a live audience under a lot of pressure. And we in the media, we're getting a sense of what questions might be asked during trial, how these witnesses are going to hold up, and how they might look and sound and feel to a live jury of their peers. Now, to your question about this DNA evidence, you know, we spent the bulk of the afternoon going through that testimony. It started with questions from Deputy DA Beth Silverman. It was her witness. Samantha Tosh, an LAPD criminalist, who's from the LAPD Crime Lab, who is responsible for testing, analyzing, and reporting on DNA samples. And then defense attorneys did their cross-examination, and then that witness went back to the prosecution, and then defense had more questions for her. So what all of that adds up to is a lot of information that can be looked at different ways, right? None of this is actually definitive. And the witness, the LAPD criminalist, was careful to make that clear. You know, she's using language like possible or probable, but the statistics that she laid out, and we're talking about figures, right, with 24 zeros after the first digit. She laid out statistics that make it unlikely, if not close to impossible, for these DNA matches to be from anybody but Celeste. Now the question is, you know, where is that DNA match actually coming from? Is it definitively coming from blood, or could it be something like skin? Because she spent time living in that house and touching items in the garage. That's what defense attorneys spent quite a bit of time today questioning, going back and forth with that one witness. If this does go to trial, I think we can expect a lot more of that, Chris.
And there's so many pieces of evidence, I feel like, Julia, as like this has gone on for the last couple of days, where from a circumstantial standpoint, it seems incredibly strong for the prosecution, but then you'll have David's defense attorneys come back and just nitpick every single word of what a witness said. As far as some of where DNA was found, you know, there were blood stains in the Tesla, and through just kind of going through some of these notes, that there was a toenail that was Celeste, and then they were able to create a DNA profile on that. But then you get into these trash bags, I believe, that were found at David's house, right? And then there are these wipes in the trash bag, and like, it does not get, to me, it came off just kind of going through this, like, it's muddied and it's not clear who is handling what inside the house. And there's even some DNA on there that may be from other people. We don't know. Like, what did you make of kind of all of those different layers to what seems like a really complicated part of the story that the prosecution's trying to tell?
When I first heard some of that DNA evidence from the LAPD witness when the prosecution was questioning her, I felt like it was incredibly compelling evidence. I mean, you can't question something with a statistical probability that's got 24 zeros behind the first digit, right?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I guess if you are Blair Burke, you can question that. And she raised a couple hypotheticals about that compelling DNA evidence. She actually laid out a scenario about tertiary transfer, right? She told the court, what if I shook my co-counsel's hand and then I touched the podium and then the judge put her notebook down on the podium, right? Could my co-counsel's DNA then end up being transferred to that notebook? And the witness answered that on the stand. Yes, that's a possibility. So gaps like that, being created by the defense in just about everything the prosecution is laying out. That, I think, is going to be a recurring theme for the rest of this preliminary hearing, and certainly if it goes to trial. And any member of the jury listening to this, it's going to come down to what they believe, who they believe, and how much doubt the defense can cast on all of this.
So now we are going back, and today's big because this is the testimony of the deputy medical examiner, Dr. Grant Ho. Let's talk about it. Okay, let me bring in our eyes and our ears once again. Julia Deng, NBC LA reporter who has been fantastic throughout all of this. Good to see you again. There's a lot to get into here. There is a lot to get into when we talk about the deputy medical examiner's testimony. But before we even do that, we've always started by talking about David's demeanor in the courtroom. And the way that we've gone through it for the past several days, it's that he looks kind of bored. He looks like you described, the court reporter even said yesterday that he looks like he's on another plane, disengaged. Today, though, if I'm reading the notes that you sent over, a little bit different from David today, right?
A tiny bit, Jesse. He is a little bit more animated. He came in today, wearing the standard LA County jail uniform, that orange jumpsuit. He's got a shirt on underneath it. Hair is kind of grown out. He looks tired, unshaven, but he did seem a little bit more animated. He sat down, had a conversation with one of his defense attorneys, and then started smiling and chit-chatting a little bit with her. That was different. But once testimony started up again, and we were hearing from the deputy medical examiner, one of two people involved in actually performing the autopsy on Celeste after her remains were found in David's Tesla, he went back to his usual, expressionless, emotionless, really motionless pose sitting at the counsel table. He's staring straight ahead, kind of just blinking at the witness on the stand, staring at the exhibits on that overhead monitor, and really not moving, not reacting.
And by the way, before we even get into the substance of the testimony, where I really think it's interesting what both this medical examiner had to say and what the defense has been saying, the photos that were shown to the whole gallery, which you saw, your reporting indicates there was an audible reaction in the courtroom to those photos. Can you describe what you mean by that?
There was an audible reaction. There was a visceral reaction. And let me describe to you what happened, possibly by accident. Before we were actually shown the exhibits that we were supposed to see in the order that they were supposed to be presented, during this deputy medical examiner's testimony, the projector in the courtroom actually flipped through numerous autopsy photos before we were supposed to see that. So imagine, right, this overhead monitor, kind of like flipbook style, in a matter of seconds, going through probably about half a dozen photos. And I'm talking autopsy photos, showing the victim's torso, open chest cavity, extremities, laid out, cleaned off and laid out on a silver exam table. There was an audible gasp. A reporter sitting behind me in the courtroom, you could hear her reacting to this. You could see everybody reacting, I think, very viscerally. But Dr. Grant Ho, the witness on the stand right now, he's going through this methodically, step by step. For him, this is his day-to-day. This is just part of his job, and he's answering the questions that way. There's nothing emotional, nothing grisly or gruesome about any of this to him.
Makes you think about that job. I mean, my gosh. Okay, so today's an important day. There has been so much about evidence about David's alleged illegal relationship with Celeste. There's been a lot of evidence and testimony regarding the potential cleanup, the dismemberment. When it comes to the actual killing, when it comes to the actual alleged murder, this is what we were waiting for. What did Dr. Grant Ho say about the cause and manner of death of Celeste Rivas Hernandez?
There is a lot of back and forth during this cross-examination now of Dr. Grant Ho, but he repeated findings from the medical examiner's office that have already been published. This was released months ago. We have reported on this, but he walked us through, with the support of visuals this time that we have not previously seen from the autopsy. He walked us through what they already found months ago. They decided the cause and manner of death of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez was homicide, and they attributed her death to multiple penetrating injuries. Here's what's interesting, though. They did not identify what kind of weapon or tool caused those penetrating injuries. And they stopped short of actually calling it a penetrating injury caused by a sharp instrument. So they're not saying that she was definitely stabbed to death. And that's because of the advanced state of decomposition. They simply don't know for sure exactly how or what caused a lot of what they found, which we are looking at right now in the courtroom, documented in these very, very visual exhibits.
Let me tell you why that's so significant. You know, but our audience should know. One of the special circumstance allegations in this case that has been presented by prosecutors is that David Anthony Burke personally used a deadly and dangerous weapon, a sharp instrument, to commit this crime. And yet what you're telling us is this deputy medical examiner can't definitively say that that's the case.
We don't know that for sure. And I think defense attorneys made a point of underscoring that several times. That is one of the elements of this first-degree felony murder charge that is interesting, that is different, right? And if he is convicted, there could be a sharp instrument enhancement. I believe in the state of California that could tack on an additional consecutive year. But those 3 additional special circumstances, that makes this murder case eligible for the death penalty. Here's what else the deputy medical examiner doesn't know for sure. And defense leaned really hard into all of this on cross. They don't know which penetrating injury occurred first. There's one on the victim's abdomen, and there's one on her lateral left chest. So one is associated possibly with liver damage, the other possibly with rib damage and diaphragm damage. Deputy Emmy can't say which one happened first. He can't say definitively whether or not they may have happened seconds apart. He cannot say which one caused her death. He cannot say how long it may have taken Celeste to die from either one of those injuries. There's so much we simply don't know. And that created a gap for one of the defense attorneys to ask something that we have not heard yet in this case. She asked this witness, this deputy medical examiner, if he could rule out that Celeste may have inflicted both of these stab wounds on her own. And he said, based on his findings in this autopsy, that was not something that he could definitively rule out. The reaction in the courtroom following that line of questioning, though, I turned around and I could see a couple people, glancing at each other, eyebrows raised. It looked and felt to me like people watching this line of questioning felt like it may have been bordering on the absurd. It may not be something a jury would believe.
Let's map that out for a second. So in other words, and this is based on what we saw this week from the defense, they are potentially building the argument, if this goes to trial, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Celeste would have come over to his place, something happened, she killed herself or had an overdose, David panicked and tried to get rid of her body. I mean, is that something that you see the building blocks for, even though they've tried to, because remember, one of the most significant things I think the defense has been trying to do is saying, well, all these alleged purchases the chainsaws, the laundry bags, the body bag was all after she allegedly died. So it's not like he planned to kill her. Am I understanding that that's maybe the building blocks of where they may go as a potential defense?
Jesse, I don't know if that's where the defense is actively trying to go. I think this is their opportunity during this preliminary hearing to kind of test out different lines of questioning, right? See what sticks, see where the biggest openings might be for them to just create more gaps in the prosecution's case. I don't believe that line of questioning is going to go anywhere. But here's how they laid it out this morning. Marilyn Bednarski was the one asking Dr. Grant Ho these questions. She wanted to know first, is it helpful for somebody doing an autopsy to maybe have information about whether the decedent has a mental health history?
First, a musician worth $11.5 million, career on an upward trajectory, faces murder charges. Second, his defense team doesn't deny he had her remains in his car, but argues the prosecution can't prove how she died. Third, the medical examiner who performed the autopsy admits under oath he doesn't know if she was stabbed, shot, or something else entirely. Fourth, a chainsaw was ordered online, delivered to the house, and has never been found. Fifth, one of the prosecutor's own special circumstance allegations that a sharp instrument was used might not hold up based on what the autopsy couldn't establish.
Prosecutors is that David Anthony Burke personally used a deadly and dangerous weapon, a sharp instrument, to commit this crime. And yet what you're telling us is this deputy medical examiner can't definitively say that that's the case.
We don't know that for sure. And I think defense attorneys made a point of underscoring that several times. That is one of the elements of this first-degree felony murder charge that is interesting, that is different, right? And if he is convicted, there could be a sharp instrument enhancement. I believe in the state of California that could tack on an additional consecutive year. But those 3 additional special circumstances, that makes this murder case eligible for the death penalty.
What we're looking at here is a case where the circumstantial evidence feels overwhelming, but the forensic record leaves gaps large enough that a jury might never get absolute answers. This video separates what the evidence actually shows from what people assume it proves. Over 3 days in a Los Angeles courtroom, during a preliminary hearing, prosecutors presented testimony meant to establish probable cause that David Burke killed Celeste Rivas Hernandez, a 14-year-old who vanished in April of 2025. By September, her decomposed and dismembered remains were found in the front trunk of a Tesla registered to him. The charge is first-degree murder, continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14, and unlawful mutilation of human remains. But here's the thing that surprised many observers following the case closely when the deputy medical examiner took the stand. On day 3 of the hearing, he could not tell the courtroom definitively how Celeste died.
With you because I loved watching it. So yes, I was sitting right behind David this morning. I somehow got a seat in front of where they were seating other reporters. I think it's because I actually walked in a little bit later than everybody else did. So because of that, they had me seated on the end of one of the attorneys' rows in that courtroom, and I was right behind David. He didn't look too great. You know, his hair is grown out. He is unshaven. He's wearing that LA County jail uniform, that orange jumpsuit, and he still has his feet and his waist shackled. He's not wearing handcuffs, though, so he was kind of splayed out in his chair, arms on his armrest.
Dr. Grant Ho, one of 2 physicians who performed the autopsy, testified that the cause of death was homicide and that it resulted from multiple penetrating injuries. That much was established. But, and this is the critical pivot, he could not identify the weapon or tool that created those injuries. He could not say with certainty whether she was stabbed with a knife, struck with a sharp instrument, or shot with a firearm. He could not identify which of the 2 main penetrating wounds occurred first, on her abdomen and her left chest. He could not say which one killed her, or how long she suffered. The advanced state of decomposition had erased that specificity from the record. This matters because prosecutors have alleged, as a special circumstance, that David Burke personally used a deadly and dangerous weapon, specifically a sharp instrument, to commit the crime. That allegation makes the case eligible for the death penalty. But if the medical examiner cannot confirm the weapon type, that element of the charge becomes harder to prove beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. Defense attorney Marilyn Bednarski leaned heavily into this gap during cross-examination, asking Dr. Ho whether he could rule out that Celeste may have inflicted the injuries on herself. He said he could not rule it out. When that question was asked, observers in the courtroom described visible reactions, raised eyebrows, exchanged glances, as if recognizing a line of questioning that, while legally permissible, seemed unlikely to convince a jury. So let's map what the evidence actually shows versus what narratives have built up around it. The Tesla itself became the center of forensic investigation. Celeste's remains were found in the front trunk, wrapped in cadaver bags. But that car didn't just contain a body. Investigators discovered 11 air fresheners distributed throughout the interior, in the center console, back seats, and notably, in the front trunk where the remains lay. That detail tells a story about cover-up. Someone noticed the smell.
The prosecutor was showing the court of 11 different air fresheners that were found in that Tesla. I mean, Celeste's remains had been in there decomposing, likely for months. So to cover up that smell, somebody put nearly a dozen air fresheners, not just inside the car, but actually in the front trunk.
Yeah.
And that's where the cadaver bags with her remains were found. So it's not just that this crime was committed, it's that somebody went to truly horrifying lengths, Jesse, to try.
Someone went to deliberate lengths to mask it. But the air fresheners are not evidence of how she died. They're evidence of an attempt to conceal decomposition. There's a meaningful difference. Inside David's garage in the Hollywood Hills house, investigators conducted a search approximately 1 week after the Tesla was discovered. They found chainsaws. Specifically, they found 2 chainsaws that tested negative for blood.
Defense attorney Blair Burke noted there was no positive test indicating the possibility of blood on those chainsaws, so she kept on asking this LAPD witness for the prosecution why they didn't take those chainsaws into evidence. It sounded like she wanted to make the point that touch DNA, which they didn't test for, may have indicated something else, may have painted a more comprehensive picture of what exactly happened and who may have been involved, who else may have been involved, that is. But the criminalist was very sharp, very clear with her answers. At one point yesterday, she even brought her notes back out to make sure that she gave precisely the information that was documented during this investigation. So she said there did not appear to be any kind of forensic value to those chainsaws that were found in the garage, and that's why they were not taken into evidence. So my big takeaway from all of this is that perhaps those were not the weapons or tools used for dismemberment, even though they were found in David's garage during this search.
The prosecution had to account for these tools, found in the defendant's home, in a case involving a dismembered body, and the first instinct might be to assume they were used as weapons or dismemberment tools. But when the LAPD criminalist who processed the scene was asked why those chainsaws weren't taken into evidence, her answer was straightforward: there was no forensic value. If they had been used to dismember the body, she testified, blood would have been present in quantities detectable by their testing. The absence of that blood, she explained, suggested these tools were not the ones used. But here's the complication that hasn't received enough attention. There was a third chainsaw, a Makita brand chainsaw, ordered online and delivered to David's address.
Correct on the first point, there was another chainsaw, a Makita brand chainsaw that we talked about the other day that was ordered online and delivered to David's house. As far as I know, from the evidence presented so far, that chainsaw was not located during this search. The 2 other chainsaws, and here's why the criminalist said there really was no forensic value. She testified earlier that had they been used for dismemberment, there would have been no way for blood to be cleaned up to the point where their testing did not indicate something of forensic value. So when they did that initial test on scene and there was no presumptive positive, they elected not to take those two chainsaws into evidence. But yes, there is a missing one. There is another one, and I'm sure that's going to come up later in this.
That chainsaw has not been located. Defense attorneys have raised questions about touch DNA that was never tested on the recovered chainsaws, creating what they argue is an incomplete forensic picture. The prosecution, meanwhile, hasn't presented a specific murder weapon or any clear evidence of where a potential weapon went. They've built a circumstantial case around motive, opportunity, and the fact that the victim was in his care, but the physical mechanism of death remains contested. Also discovered in the garage jugs of fake blood. This detail circulated widely in early coverage, but no one has presented testimony explaining why fake blood was present, or when it was acquired, or in what context. It remains an unexplained element, suggestive of something but unconfirmed. In true crime coverage, details like this often get absorbed into a narrative of guilt when the actual forensic record keeps them separate. The fake blood is evidence of something. It's not yet evidence of the murder itself. The medical examiner's testimony introduced another layer of forensic uncertainty. When Dr. Ho described the state of decomposition, he noted that when Celeste's remains were weighed, they came to 71 pounds. Decomposition had progressed significantly. Skin slippage was extensive. There was insect activity, maggots present at the beginning stages when the body was first examined. Dental records were used to make the positive identification, because there simply wasn't enough physical structure left for visual recognition. In that context, his inability to identify the weapon becomes less a failure of investigation and more a limitation of what the evidence can tell us. Decomposition alters wound characteristics. It changes the appearance of cuts and penetrating injuries post-mortem. What might have been clean edges weeks earlier becomes indistinct. The medical examiner's language was careful. He used terms like possible and probable rather than definitive statements. When asked about the two main penetrating wounds, one on the abdomen possibly associated with liver damage, the other on the left chest possibly associated with rib and diaphragm damage, he could not say which came first, which was deeper, or which was ultimately fatal. Defense attorneys, particularly Bednarski, used this uncertainty to build gaps. She asked whether it would have been helpful for the medical examiner to know about Celeste's mental health history, whether she was suicidal, whether she was a habitual drug user. To each question, he answered, potentially. She then asked whether he'd had any conversations with the defendant's family to explore those characteristics. He had not. She was building a framework, not necessarily an argument that will succeed, but an argument that can be made. The framework is this: decomposition made certainty impossible. The prosecution's evidence is circumstantial, and alternative scenarios, however unlikely, cannot be ruled out with absolute medical certainty. This is where media literacy matters. Over weeks of coverage, a narrative can form that feels like settled fact. She was stabbed, dismembered with a chainsaw, murdered to prevent her from exposing an illegal relationship. But the actual courtroom record shows something more complicated. The prosecution is building a case on financial motive. If Celeste came forward about the alleged sexual abuse, she could destroy an $11.5 million career.
Financial management. They were essentially talking about how much money he made through his record deal and how that money was divvied up. Because so many people were involved in this operation. So many people were making money off of him, to put it bluntly. And that's a key part of this case, because murder for financial gain is one of the special circumstances here that makes this eligible for the death penalty. But the district attorney, Nathan Hochman, did say yesterday they haven't actually decided yet if that's something they're going to pursue.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because the idea is, and I'm going to get to the witnesses who testified today, if they can show how lucrative his career was, at $11.5 million, that if Celeste came out and exposed him for this alleged illegal...
That's motive. The prosecution shows she was in his home, under his care. That's opportunity. The prosecution shows her remains were in his vehicle, and her DNA appears in locations consistent with that scenario. That's circumstantial evidence of presence and involvement. But the how, the specific act, the specific weapon, the specific mechanism of death remains forensically uncertain. This is not unusual in cases involving advanced decomposition. It's not evidence that the prosecution's case is weak. It's evidence that death, once it occurs and time passes, erases details. Juries and observers often expect medical certainty that biology doesn't always provide. The prosecution's challenge at trial will be whether probable cause in a preliminary hearing is sufficient. versus whether the gaps created by decomposition and defense questioning will introduce reasonable doubt. One detail worth noting, because it's often underexplored in coverage, the financial witness who testified about David's income was combative and inconsistent. Benjamin Greger, a finance director associated with David's management, testified about how the $11.5 million deal was structured and how proceeds were distributed among multiple people managing the career.
Yes, he does come across as a little bit combative when he's talking to prosecutors, when he's talking to the deputy DA here, Beth Silverman. When she was cross-examining him, there were several instances where he gave her answers that not just misaligned, but were in direct opposition to what he apparently said during grand jury hearings. And she was actually referencing transcripts from those secret grand jury hearings to verify that, to be like, wait a minute, did you mean this house or the other house was going to be put up as collateral so David could make bail? And then she asked him very pointedly several times, is your testimony accurate today or was it accurate then? So I think any instance where a witness is apparently changing their story on the stand, it makes you wonder, who had they been talking to?
Deputy DA Beth Silverman Cross examined him using transcripts from secret grand jury hearings, catching him in contradictions about which house was being discussed as collateral for bail, and asking pointedly, is your testimony accurate today, or was it accurate then? When a witness changes their story on the stand, it raises questions about whether they've been contacted, whether a deal has been struck, what's in it for them. The prosecution's own witness introduced ambiguity into the motive narrative. That's the kind of detail that often gets compressed into a summary. He was making millions, so he killed her to protect his career. But the courtroom record is messier. Witnesses aren't always cooperative. Their narratives can be inconsistent. Juries will have to weigh credibility. Here's the open question we should sit with. If decomposition had not advanced so far, if the body had been discovered sooner, what would the medical examiner have been able to tell us?
That's right, Chris. We just broke for the day. We actually didn't think we were going to get to this witness today, but Dr. Grant Ho took the stand just about 4 minutes before we wrapped for today, day 3 of this preliminary hearing in the murder case against 21-year-old David Anthony Burke. So he just started laying out his findings from this autopsy conducted September 10th. That was 2 days after this teenager's remains were found in the front trunk of David's Tesla. He's testifying about the state of decomposition. It was tough, incredibly tough to see the photos the other day in court. Hearing this testimony now from the deputy medical examiner who actually led the autopsy, this might be even tougher, Chris, in different ways. So I completely understood when the victim's parents actually got up and left the courtroom before he took the stand. They are not sitting in there for this testimony. But he's talking about the state of decomposition. He testified that when they weighed her remains, it only came out to 71 pounds. The last thing he said on the stand before we ended today was that she still had her braces on.
Would the weapon have been identifiable? Would the sequence of injuries have been clear? Would the cause of death have been unambiguous? We're trying a case based on a body found after months of environmental exposure. The evidence is degraded. The forensic record is incomplete. This isn't a courtroom failure or an investigation failure. It's a biology problem. The defendant had time, and the environment did the rest. When the case moves to trial, if it does, jurors will face the same question. They'll see the circumstantial evidence pointing toward guilt. They'll see the DNA matches with those extraordinary statistical probabilities, 24 zeros after the first digit, meaning it's nearly impossible for that DNA to belong to anyone but Celeste.
And it was her witness, Samantha Tosh, an LAPD criminalist, who's from the LAPD crime lab, who is responsible for testing, analyzing, and reporting on DNA samples. And then defense attorneys did their cross-examination, and then that witness went back to the prosecution And then defense had more questions for her. So what all of that adds up to is a lot of information that can be looked at different ways, right? None of this is actually definitive. And the witness, the LAPD criminalist, was careful to make that clear. You know, she's using language like possible or probable, but the statistics that she laid out, and we're talking about figures, right, with 24 zeros after the first digit. She laid out statistics that make it unlikely, if not close to impossible, for these DNA matches to be from anybody but Celeste.
They'll see the financial motive, the opportunity, the attempted cover-up suggested by the air fresheners and the garage disposal efforts. But they'll also hear from the medical examiner. On cross-examination that he cannot identify the weapon, they'll hear that alternative scenarios, however remote, cannot be ruled out with absolute certainty. And they'll have to decide whether that uncertainty is reasonable doubt or merely the artifact of a body decomposed over months. The preliminary hearing phase is a lower threshold. Prosecutors need only show probable cause, roughly 51%. At trial, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, 99.9% certainty. The gap between those two standards is where reasonable people can disagree about what the evidence means. Defense attorney Blair Burke has already shown how she'll work that gap at trial, questioning everything the prosecution presents. When Samantha Tosh, the LAPD criminalist, testified about DNA evidence and transfer, Burke raised the issue of tertiary transfer. Theoretically, if one person touched something and a second person touched that something, could the DNA of the first person end up on a third object?
Well, I guess if you are Blair Burke, you can question that. And she raised a couple hypotheticals about that compelling DNA evidence. She actually laid out a scenario about tertiary transfer, right? She told the court, what if I shook my co-counsel's hand and then I touched the podium and then the judge put her notebook down on the podium, right? Could my co-counsel's DNA then end up being transferred to that notebook? And the witness answered that on the stand, yes.
The witness said yes, that's possible. It's an extreme scenario, unlikely to explain the DNA matches in this case, but it's a logical opening to create doubt. This is what watching a preliminary hearing from the inside reveals that headlines often miss. The case isn't settled by what prosecutors present. It's complicated by how defense attorneys interrogate it, and the record, once you sit with it carefully, is much messier than a summary suggests. The victim's parents were in the courtroom for much of the hearing, but they were not present when the deputy medical examiner described the state of decomposition and the insect activity. That's a choice some families make when facing testimony they know will be painful. The reporter covering the case noted seeing them in the hallway afterward. Private people, suddenly at the center of a high-profile murder case, now facing detailed descriptions of their daughter's remains. That human context matters. This isn't just a forensic puzzle or a legal strategy exercise. A girl was killed. A family lost someone. Whatever the weapon, whatever the specifics of how death occurred, the harm is absolute. But from a legal standpoint, what the preliminary hearing record establishes is this: the prosecution has probable cause to believe David Burke was involved in Celeste's death and the concealment of her body. Whether they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt, using a weapon the medical examiner can identify with a timeline that decomposition has obscured is a question for trial. The record we have is incomplete, not because investigators failed, but because time and biology don't preserve certainty forever. The next phase of this case will likely involve motions, discovery disputes, and eventually a trial where these questions are litigated again in front of a jury. One thing that hasn't emerged publicly yet: whether investigators ever identified the $11.5 million deal that David was negotiating, and whether that deal's terms and timeline matter to establishing when and why Celeste became a threat. That's the financial thread that connects motive to opportunity. The prosecution will need to make that connection clear and convincing. The defense will continue to create gaps, questioning weapon identification, suggesting alternative scenarios, highlighting what the evidence doesn't prove as much as what it does. What do you think happens when this reaches trial? Do you believe the circumstantial evidence? The motive, the opportunity, the DNA, the cover-up efforts is enough to meet the beyond a reasonable doubt standard even with the weapon unknown? Or does the gap created by the medical examiner's inability to identify how she died create space for reasonable doubt? Drop your take in the comments. We'll be covering the trial developments as they unfold, and your perspective matters to understanding how different people interpret the same forensic